If you're looking for a chic Chanel style lightweight cardigan stroke jacket for the spring and summer, well, you're in the right place, because today we're going to be doing the sew along for the Itch to Stitch Teifi cardigan. If you've just stumbled across this vlog, then go and watch last week's sew along vlog where I go through all the equipment and fabric types, etc., and cutting the pattern out, and then come back, because this week we've got our pattern cut out and we're going to sew it along together. So get your machine fired up and let's get making our Teifi cardigan. Hi there, I'm Christine the Gemini Stitcher, and welcome to my little sewing space. Yes, you heard right, the sun's shining and I'm making a cardigan for layering up, but we all know that the British summer will not stay in the 20s and 30s all the time, and a nice stylish cardigan to go in our capsule collection is going to be a must. So you all voted for the Teifi cardigan from Itch to Stitch. Last week we got it all cut out and ready to go, and I chose this leopard print jacquard fabric. Now I got this from Guthrie and Garnett, but yes, you guessed right, they haven't got any left. But anything like this, a ponte, a jacquard knit, even sweat knits and French terries will work absolutely fine. So your more structured knits, not your really stretchy fabric for this one. So I'll just run through the pattern pieces to make sure we've got them all before we start. We've got 2 of the collar pieces, and I've already put some stretch interfacing onto one of these. Now, it's got the interfacing on, but it's still got a bit of stretch to it. Not as much as it did have without the interfacing, you can see the difference. So it gives stretch knits a little bit of structure, but still some stretch to them. I've grabbed a little piece of this stretch interfacing because it can be a little bit of a head scratcher. Now, you can see me tugging on that, and it's really not stretching very much at all. So you'd think, that's not stretch interfacing. But what you've got to bear in mind is it's got the glue on the back, and that's what's stopping it from stretching. So when you iron it onto your pattern piece, it releases the glue and allows it to stretch with your fabric. So don't panic if you think you've got stretch interfacing, but it's not stretching. So we've got our collar pieces, 2 of those. We've got our pocket flaps, and we've got 2 sets, so you need 4 of these in total, 2 for each pocket. I've cut the pocket piece out, you need 2 of those. We've got the back piece, which doesn't have a yoke, it's just a plain back, so you need 1 of those on the fold. I've got 2 of the front pieces, and I don't know if you can see, I've put my tailor's tacks in where my pocket flap and my pocket's going to go. I prefer tailor's tacks when I'm doing pockets. You can just use a removable marker if you like, but I think tailor's tacks on pockets are more accurate. And 2 sleeve pieces, so there's no cuffs on this, it's just a straight edge on the sleeves and a straight edge at the bottom of the bodice. So not a huge amount of pattern pieces. Now I can get the Teifi cardigan out of just short of 1.5 meters of fabric. which I think is pretty good going. So I'm going to read the instructions and then we'll fire the machine up and get cracking on the Teifi. Before we start, I just thought I'd read what they say about the Teifi, just to check it's actually the cardigan or jacket cardigan for you. Welcome to the Teifi cardigan sewing pattern. The Teifi is a jacket style versatile sweater that perfectly blends comfort and style. Designed for structured knit fabrics, it provides the ease and coziness you love in a sweater while still giving you a polished and put together appearance. Whether you dress it up or down, the Teifi cardigan is sure to be a staple in your wardrobe this spring and summer. And I think it's going to be a staple in my capsule wardrobe as well. So the first thing we've got to do is get our interfacing out and apply that to all the pattern pieces that need it. So I'll just run through those with you now and then I'll bob back when I've put all mine on, because you don't want to see me ironing. It's boring. So you put interfacing strips along the top of the back bodice. Now, this is so you're going to put it just across that section there. A narrow 1-inch strip is all you need, and it just helps stabilise your shoulders and stops them from bagging out when you keep taking your cardigan on and off, and makes it wear longer and keep its shape. So narrow strips of interfacing. You can use your stretch interfacing. It's what I'm going to do. It says stay tape on the instructions, but I'm just going to cut a couple of narrow pieces of this and use it across the top of the back shoulders. You also need to interface 2 of your 4 pocket flaps. Again, it adds stability to them, and we're using the knit or stretch interfacing for those. I've already mentioned that you need to interface 1 of your collar pieces, which I'd already done, just to show you how stretch interfacing can be a little bit deceiving when you think it's not stretching when you look at it before you iron it on. So 1 of your collar pieces needs doing. You need 2 pieces of interfacing down the front where you're going to create your placket, and they say 4.7 centimetres, which will basically be from the edge to where your second line is, and that's where your fold's going to be for your front placket. So you need to do that on both of your front pieces. And then the last little bit of interfacing is going to be on top of our pockets, and it's just up to where that little notch is, and you're just going to put interfacing across both of your pocket pieces just to keep your pocket stable. If you keep dipping in and out of them, stops them from bagging out. So I'm going to get all that interfacing ironed on, and then we can start sewing. So I've got all my interfacing on all of my pattern pieces. Now with this vlog, I'm going to do it a little bit different than the last ones that I've done. I'm going to read through the instructions in detail and go through them and do them as the pattern instructions. So I'm not going to go rogue. So let's see how the pattern fares on the understanding level. So the first thing you're going to do is, if you've done the full bust option, I haven't, but if you have, then you've got a dart to sew in the front. So it says, sew bust dart on front, take care not to stretch the fabric, that's a good point, while stitching. Press the dart bulk down and repeat for the other front. So a way that you can stop it from stretching out when you're doing that dart is to spray a little bit of best press when you've pinned it onto your fabric to give it a little bit more structure, and hopefully your bust dart won't stretch out. Because we don't want a stretchy bust, do we? So, sorry, I couldn't resist that one. So then we're all going on together, whichever option you've chosen. If you've not done the full bust option, you go to step number 7. And the first thing we're going to do is sew our shoulder seams. So the instructions say, with right sides together, pin the front to the back at the shoulder, stitch, stroke, serge, press the stitch seam open, and if you've done a serge or overlock seam, press it towards the back. Finish the seam as desired and do the other shoulder. Now, I said I wasn't going rogue and I am already, but you know, it's just little things that make life easier. So I'm going to be using my baby lock overlocker, so I am simply serging the seams and pressing them to the back. If you're doing it on a sewing machine, don't forget you need your zigzag stitch or lightning bolt stitch, or if you're lucky enough to have some Mariflex thread, then you can use that and just use your normal straight stitch. So if you're doing the shoulders on your sewing machine, I would highly recommend finishing the seam edges first. So zigzag stitch the shoulder seam edges and then sew it together and then press the seam open. It's just easier. A lot of patterns tell you to sew the seam first and then finish them. I just find it easier to finish the seam before you sew it if you're going to press it open flat. So that's the only thing I'm doing differently. Well, I'm not, because I'm on the serger, overlocker, serger, whatever you want to call it. So I'm just literally going to serge, overlock the shoulder seams and press them to the back. So I've put my sleeves in on the flat, straight on the overlocker, and it's finished the seams for me. Now you can do it on your sewing machine using your lightning bolt or zigzag stitch. And if you're new to using your overlocker, because the sleeves are on a curve and curves can be tricky suckers, I suggest that you use your sewing machine, do a tacking stitch on your sewing machine to hold the sleeve in place, and then overlock it and go over where your tacking stitch is, and you should be good to go. It will stop it from shifting. If you're a smarty pants like me, you just use clips and do it on your overlocker. So we've got the sleeves in and they need pressing into the sleeve. Let's see what we're doing next. Next, it's the side seams. With right sides together, pin front and back at the side, matching notches and underarm seams. So we're doing the side seam and under the arm all in one go. Stitch, stroke, serge from bodice bottom to the sleeve bottom. Press stitched seam towards the back. Repeat for the other side. So we're going to put our garment right sides together, front to the back, and the sleeves right sides together. So you're going to have a seam that goes from the edge of your jacket past the seam of the sleeve, underarm seam, and all the way down to the cuff. So the only thing that they've not said to do that I would do is try and get this underarm seam matching. And the way to do that is take a pin, push it through one side right where the seam is, and then do the same with the other side. And pin it through just to hold that in place. Now, I know we're on a serger or overlocker and we don't use pins. This is the only time that I use a pin, but please, please, please be careful that you don't forget to take that pin out. And then I also put a pin on the other side of that seam just to hold it all in place. Now, again, if you're new to your overlocker or you're using your sewing machine, then you don't need to worry about taking that pin out. You're going to take them out as you go. Because if you're new to your serger, again, you can tack it on your sewing machine and then serge it. But if you're doing it on your sewing machine, it's that seam thing again, isn't it? There's two things you can do. You can finish all those seams off with a zigzag stitch before you start, or you can zigzag them together when you sew the seam. There's no reason that you need to press that seam flat, so my preference on the sewing machine would be sew the seam, zigzag stitch the seam finishes together, or just leave them. Up to you. I'm going to be doing mine on my overlocker, and I'm just clipping it and overlocking it, but keeping my eye on where I've put those two pins. If you're worried about those pins, then you can just go on your sewing machine and just tack that seam under the arm before you start sewing, and then it'll hold it in place. So I'll get those two done and see you back here in a minute. Okay, so I've sewn the underarm and the sleeve seams, and I'm now giving this cardigan a little try on just to check I'm happy with the shoulders and the length of the sleeves before we carry on, just to set my mind at rest. I'm happy with the fit, and I think it's going to be amazeballs when it's finished. So let's have a read what we're going to do next. Now, when I've done this before, the first thing I've done is, while all the pieces are in the flat, I've put the pockets on, shoulders, collar. They're doing it a little bit differently, and I just wanted to do it the way the pattern does it, just to see if they've got a better idea than me. I'm not sure, because you've got all these pieces sewn together now. It's just bulk round your machine. It's easier to do all the fiddly bits while they're individual pieces. That's what I think anyway. Let me know how you get on. But we've got the sleeves in and the underarm seams done, and now we're going to move on to the collar. So let's see what the instructions say about the collar, because this is the little bit that I thought might be the challenge. But we can do it together, girls. So let's read what it says. So we're going to take our, if I could find them, we're going to take our collar pieces. We've got one that's interfaced and one that isn't. And it says, with right sides together, pin interfaced and non-interfaced collar together. Stitch or serge the side and long edges. If the seam is stitched, grade the seam with the interfaced collar seam allowance and trim it shorter. So, sorry about that, I was reading it and figuring it out at the same time. So we're going to get our two collar pieces and put them right sides together. And then we're not going to sew this curved or wavy edge. We're sewing along the top, the short side, all the way down the straight side and along the bottom side. Now there's two options with this. You can just be clever like me and sew it on your overlocker, which cuts the seam allowance off and makes a nice neat finish. Or if you're doing it on the sewing machine, when you've sewn the seam all the way round, then you need to get some small scissors. I use these duck scissors, and that round bit goes underneath and stops you cutting accidentally through the wrong layer. So you're just going to trim the interfaced seam down by half to reduce the bulk in your collar and make a neater seam. So I'm going to do mine on my overlocker sheet, and then we'll read the next instruction together. So let's read the next instruction, and then I'll explain how I've worked it out, because this one is important. It's the start of fitting your collar. But we're going to take our time and it will be fine. So the instructions actually say, pin the collar to the front stroke back neckline with your non-interfaced side against the right side, or it means the right side of the actual jacket. Match the centre back's collar notch to shoulder seam and front notch to the collar edge above the buttonholes. Baste with 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'll grab the pattern piece and hopefully you'll be able to see on here. So we've got lots of notches at the neckline here. We've got a notch right near the neckline, then we've got one there which is the fold for the placket, then the next one along with all the little jagged lines underneath is where your buttonholes are going, and then the last one is the other side of the placket when it's folded. So make sure you've got those notches on your front pattern pieces, and if you haven't, place this back over and get them all on. So the one that we're looking at is the third one in from the edge, which is the one that's above where your buttonholes are. And that is the point where you're going to start pinning your collar. So I would pin that at one side, do the same at the other side, and then match your notches up and get it all pinned. So this is what I've ended up with. There's 1, 2, 3 notches, so I've pinned it at the third notch, and the interface side is at the top, and sandwiched in between the jacket and the top layer of the collar is the uninterfaced side, because that's going to be the underneath of your collar. So it's all been pinned in, lots of pins all the way around to the notch that's the third one in at this side, and we're going to baste it in place on the sewing machine just to hold everything where it is for now. So there we go, we've got our neckband basted onto our collar, basted onto our neckband. Now, when you've done this, just take your time with it, check on the inside that there aren't any little puckers because it's on a curve, you can end up with little puckers. If you do, just unpick either side of it, pull it straight and re-stitch that little bit, just to make sure your collar's all gonna lie nice and flat. So what are we doing now? It's time to bring out the bias binding. Now, you can use contrast bias binding. There's all sorts of options out there. It would be quite nice with a nice satin bias binding in. I've got some of this really soft needle cord bias binding that I've had for ages, and it's in a nice cream colour. So I'm going to put some of this on the inside of mine. It'll be nice and soft around the neck area. So let's read the instructions and see what they say about applying this bias binding, because the bias binding, we've got a raw edge where this neck edge is now, and the bias binding is going to cover up that raw edge. So it says, with right sides together, pin the bias woven fabric to the neckline, sandwiching the collar in between. Start at the notches above the buttonhole on one front and end at the notch on the other front. Trim excess bias woven fabric. So it's basically going over that seam that we've just done. You've got your collar at the front, so you're going to have your collar facing you, the inside of your fabric away from you. And you're going to get your bias binding and find the end of it. Undo one end. You've got two, well, I've got two folds in mine, so you're going to use unfold one end and start pinning that all the way from one end of where you've tacked it to the other. Now I'm leaving a little bit extra at the end. Don't know why, just in case I need it to tuck in and make a nice neat finish, but we'll see. I may not need it, but it won't do any harm just to leave it there just in case. So I'm going to pin that all the way along to the other end, leave a little bit extra on that end as well, and then we're going to stitch all the way from one end to the other with 1 centimetre 3/8 seam allowance. Now, to make sure that you're stitching the other side of that tacking stitch that you've already put in, I would sew it, pin it on, and then sew it from the side where you can see the tacking stitch, just to make sure you go the other side of it, and then you've not got to start unpicking it because you can see it in your seam. So I'm going to pin that, get that sewn, and then we'll get on to the next bit. So there we go, that's the bias binding sewn onto the collar, sandwiching the collar in between the actual jacket. Now the next step tells you to turn this bias binding back on itself. So it's going to do that, if you like. Now, because my seam's quite bulky in here, I'm going to trim this seam down by half before I do that, just to reduce the bulk on that collar, because there's a lot of layers in there. Then I'm going to turn it over. So you turn it over back on itself, and then you're going to stitch it so that it's just inside where the tacking stitches were. So you're going to see a line of stitching there on your bias binding, but that's absolutely fine. So we're done with the collar, amazingly. That was easier than I thought. I hope you found it easy. So there's the outside of the collar, all nice and neat. And then on the inside, I've sewn it on the underside near the edge, and then you just end up with a nice neat row of stitching on the side that's going to be the outside of the binding, and it's finished that neck edge off really nicely. So the next thing we're going to start working on is our front plackets, and the first thing that it tells us to do is finish the vertical front edge of front as desired. Repeat for the other front. So this edge here where you've got your interfacing is the edge it's talking about, and I'm going to do mine on my overlocker. You can do it with a zigzag stitch, but we need to finish this edge off and then it's nice and neat. So let's read the next instructions. and it's all about finishing that front placket off now. So with right side facing in, fold 1 7/8 of an inch or 4.7 centimetres of the front edge onto itself, making sure the collar still points down and is partially sandwiched in between. What the heck does that mean? I've done it for you. So there's the collar and the bindings at the top, so it's folded down on the front. And this is my front placket. So on your front placket, you should have a notch at that point, that 1 7/8 of an inch. There should be a little snip, and that is your centre placket point. So at that point, just give it a quick measure and check that it's 1 7/8 or 4.7 centimetres. And you're going to fold it outwards so you can see the interfacing on the outside, and it will go over where your binding is by a tiny little bit, and that will encase your binding in and finish that off nicely. So fold it over like that and pin it in place, and do the same for the other side. Then what we're going to do is sew a line from the outside edge straight across and finish just below or exactly on where your bias binding edge is, and finish either end of those seams and do the same with the other side. Once we've done that, I pin it all at the same time. I'll read you what the next instruction says. At the bottom, make sure the front edge is fold is still 1 7/8, so the same fold at the bottom of the placket as the top. Stitch horizontally with a 1.5 inch seam allowance. So I've pinned my placket over the same all the way down from the top to the bottom, and it's at 1 7/8. Measure it to check. And then we're going to measure up 1.5 inches, and I'm going to draw a line on it, and I'm going to use that as my stitch guide and stitch from the outside edge of the placket to the edge, and do the same with the other side. So I'll go and do both those stages, and we're getting there, girls. Honestly, not far to go now. So we've got our bottom seam sewn there, and we've got our top seam sewn there, lining up with the bias tape. Now we're just going to carefully trim that seam down to a narrow seam up to just before the bias tape, and trim the bottom of it just before the edge of the seam. Turn them both out, give it all a really good press all round the collar as well, making sure that the bias tape is lying flat. And then we're nearly done with the plackets. The only thing that needs doing on them then is the buttons. Okay, I'm going a bit rogue again. The next thing it's telling us to do is turn these two placket edges the right way out. When you do that at the bottom, it automatically turns your hem in, and it tells you to press all that then. But what I want to do before I do that is just overlock the bottom edge of the jacket, just because I like a nice neat finish. So I'm going to go and do that, and then we'll read the next instructions. So stage 24, 25 and 26 are all about pressing, which is an important part of the sewing process. So basically what I've done is turn the placket the right side out, so we've got a nice neat finish there now. And then that forces up the hem at the bottom. So I've pinned it all in place, pinned the placket in place, pinned down the bias binding round the neckline, pinned the hem all the way round at 1.5 inches, sprayed it, give it all a good spray with my favourite best press, and pressed it all in place. And that's where we're at now. The next thing we need to do is do some top stitching down the front plackets to close those and keep those in place. So I'll read the instruction for that and then we'll go and do that one. So it says, point 27 says, from the right side, top stitch vertically along the front, 1 5/8 of an inch or 4.1 centimetres from the fold. Repeat for the other front. Now this is going to be the front of your jacket. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get myself my ruler, my quilting ruler, set it on that seam at 1 5/8 or 4.1 centimetres. Using a heat erasable marker pen, I'm going to mark the line down there on the front to sew along and then iron it off afterwards. That way I know it's going to be perfectly straight and it's going to be in the right place. So I'm going to go and do that, and then I think we're on to the pockets. Okay, so we've top stitched all down both sides of the front plackets. The next thing we're going to finish off, the final little finish, is to this bias binding on the inside of the neckline. We're just going to do a row of stitching all the way along the edge of the bias binding on the inside, just to make sure it stays lying flat. Now you can do this on your sewing machine, but you will have a row of stitching on the outside, but then the collar's going to fold over it anyway. Or you can do some hand stitching if hand stitching's your bag. If you've followed me for a while, you know it's not necessarily my favourite thing. So I'm going to do mine on the machine. So it's just going to be a row of stitching near the edge, just to hold that binding down and secure on the inside. So that's finished off that bias binding nice and flat, and there's just a row of stitching. I don't know if you can see it on the outside, but that's going to fold underneath the collar, so I'm not worried about that. The next thing we're going to do is top stitch all the way around the bottom to finish off the hem, and then it's just the pockets and the sleeve hems. So there we go, it's all finished, the hem's done. I also did the sleeve hems because maybe I missed it in the instructions, but I'd not read where it said do the sleeve hems, but obviously they do need doing. So I've done those. All we've got left to do is put the pockets on the front and then do the pesky buttonholes. So let's have a read about what it says about doing our pockets. So we've got 2 pockets and they've got the interfacing across the top, and it tells us to finish all the outside seams on the pockets. So I'm going to do that with the overlocker, and then we're going to fold it over where the notches are, right sides together, and just sew 2 little seams along that top edge. So let's get that done and get these pockets on our cardigan. So here we are, it's all been finished off on the overlocker and I've sewn those 2 seams down. Now the instructions now just tell you to turn that out, and you can do it because it's a stretch fabric. Your brain tells you need to snip into that corner, but there's a clever way of doing this so you don't need to snip it. I'll try and get close and then you can see. So there's the stitching. So fold that in on itself onto that side before you turn it, and then you'll get a really nice neat edge and you don't have to snip into the corner. So fold it up to where the stitching is and then turn it, and there you go, you've got your nice neat edge. So these two now form natural seams where that's been sewn. So we're going to press all the way round both the side edges and do the same seam allowance on the bottom edge of both pockets. And yes, I will be using breast press because this fabric is super springy and I know it won't press down without it. The next stage is pinning your pockets on. I don't know if you can see them on mine. I've pinned them on, I've not sewed them where the markings are for the pockets, my tailor's tacks. And I'm actually feeling like they're a bit coming under my arm a little bit too much. Maybe it's me. I'm going to have a good look in a proper mirror and then I'm possibly going to move them in to the centre a little bit more. Just a little bit too far under there for me. So I'm going to move them both in a little bit. So you don't have to have your pockets where the pattern says they're going to be. Everybody's body shape is very different, and maybe it's my boobs that are knocking the pockets out of sync, I don't know. But I'm going to have a look in the mirror, pin them where I want them to be, then top stitch them, and then we've just got the little pocket flaps to do and the buttons. So the pockets are on. If you can see it, it's there. I'm happy with the placement on them. And the only thing we've got to do now is the pocket flaps. So let's have a read what it says about those. With right sides facing, pin interfaced and non-interfaced pocket flaps together, stitch stroke serge on both sides and the bottom edge. Then we're going to turn it the right side out, press it, top stitch them, and then baste together the top edge so that it doesn't shift, and overlock the edges, and then they just need attaching to the jacket. So I've got my two pocket flaps all sewn, overlocked at the top, top stitched all the way round, and I just need to attach those onto my cardigan. Now the instructions tell you to press under 1/2 inch on the pocket flaps towards the non-interface side of the flap, because the interface side is what's going to be on top. It's the sturdiest part. So you do that, then you use that press line as the guide for sewing your pocket flap on. Then press it back down and top stitch it in place. And we're nearly there. Really, really nearly there now. I promise. Ta-da! We're all done apart from the buttons, and I've not decided which ones to put on mine yet, so I'm just gonna leave it a few days, have a think. I have got 2 or 3 options in my button stash, but this is such a beautiful finished cardigan style jacket that I'm thinking I want to buy some special buttons, but we'll see. So what do I think of the Itch to Stitch Teifi cardigan? I hope you've enjoyed the sew along. I hope I've given you some hints and tips on how to overcome the little niggles. The hardest part for me, I think, and for everybody, is going to be putting the binding round the neck, but just take your time. If you feel like your fabric's if you feel like your fabric's shifting when you're doing the binding, then just get a hand needle out, tack the binding down and then stitch it down, and then you shouldn't, hopefully, fingers crossed, have too many problems with it. Buttonholes are buttonholes, aren't they? I'm okay with them. My machine is absolutely brilliant at buttonholes. But if it's your nemesis, then don't put any on. This looks fine without it, just as just an edge-to-edge little cardigan. How often do we fasten our buttons anyway? Or as an alternative, you could put some nice press studs on. So a few alternatives there to avoid the buttons if you dread them. I made a size 6. The fit is really good. I'm chuffed to bits with it. Got the length of the sleeves right. It's definitely going to be in my capsule collection for the spring and summer. I did it in a knit jacquard fabric, which I've got to be honest, had a life of its own. So if you're going to make yours in a knit fabric that's a bit bouncy, if you're going to use pontes, which I think this is a bit ponty-ish, then they will have some bounce to them when you try and press them. Get yourself some best press, it's a lifesaver. So that's it. Did I enjoy it? Yes. Did I think the pattern instructions were in the right order? Well, at a few points I questioned it, didn't I? I would have put the collar on and done the front plackets before I put the sleeves in, just for the bulk and the amount of fabric, particularly if you've got a small sewing machine. I would switch it around and do the collar, do the shoulders, and then it says do the sleeves. I would ignore that and jump to the collar, get all the collar and the front plackets done, and then put the sleeves in and do the underarm seams. I did think that I would have liked to put the pockets on first. In hindsight, I'm glad I didn't ignore the pattern, because I changed the position of the pockets. When I tried it on, they were a bit under my armpits, so I've moved them further in and they're in a much better place for me and my boobies now. So as I said, I hope you've enjoyed. This cardigan pattern also comes with a short sleeve option, which I'll be doing as next week as part of my pattern hacking vlog, and I might make one in quilted fabric, we will see. So I'm going to have a play around with the pattern and come up with some great hacks for you for next week, but I hope I've helped you to get your first Teifi cardigan on a hanger in your capsule wardrobe collection. You may have noticed the change of location. We've come into the lounge because it's too bright. Yes, the sun's out. It got too bright in where I do the area that I do my sewing in the garden room. So I've come into the lounge and then you can actually see the cardigan finished. So I'll leave it at that, and I will see you next Monday for some makes and plans. Have a fabulous sewing weekend. Bye.